Okay, Dan, welcome and please introduce yourself.
Okay, let me open up my screen here and so we can get started. And let's get up to the top and open this all the way. Okay, everybody can hear me and everything's okay. You can see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, well, good. I want to thank you for inviting me tonight. My talk tonight is on the status and conservation of the purple martin in Northern California. I thought I would give you just a little of my background. I think I know, well, I know a number of you, but I'm a wildlife biologist, worked for years as an independent or as an environmental consultant, as well as for the Forest Service. But currently I'm retired and I'm just an independent researcher and conservation planner. I worked on bird and natural resource issues in Northern California for, I almost hate to admit it, but for 43 years. And I began working on purple martins. Usually I can say before some of you were born, but I'm not sure that's the case here. I began working on martins in 1991, which seems like a long time ago. And I never had any intention of working this long on them, actually. I have worked extensively with martins in other areas of Northern California. And then I've also done limited work with the species in Arizona, Washington state, and in the Eastern US, very limited in the Eastern US. So I thought I would just kind of give you a little life history introduction to purple martins. Before I do, let me remember to thank Lisa Alvarez, who is on the presentation here. She's my photographer, and all the good pictures are hers. The other ones are probably mine or somebody else's. This has been a cooperative project, primarily between myself and Dan Kopp, who's a birder here in Sacramento, but a large number of people over the years have helped out, as you might expect. Anyway, purple martin, the largest North American swallow. It is abundant and well-known and well-studied in Eastern North America, but it's much less common in the West, as we'll discuss later. It is a cavity nester, and as a result, they are susceptible to nest site competition from both the non-native European starling and house sparrow. They're colonial nesters, so they nest together as a group, which is I won't say an absolute requirement, but it appears to be a preference that the species has. Occasionally they nest solo. They're an aerial insectivore, so they're feeding solely on flying insects, which has some ramifications in terms of food supply and where that food comes from that we'll talk about later. And then just kind of one interesting factoid, the species is one that has a delayed adult plumage in the male. The male looks, at least superficially, like a female during its second year when it comes back. So this bird on the bottom is a second-year male, which you can tell by the dark head and small amounts of kind of randomly scattered purple feathers in the breast and belly. You will also be able to identify it if you get familiar by its behavior, because it acts like an obnoxious teenage male bird chasing females around, showing off and that sort of stuff. This shows the breeding distribution of purple martins in North America. As with eBird, this is kind of a generalized and generous depiction, but you can see major concentrations in the south, some concentration over on the northwest coast, and it's extended through the use of nest boxes all the way up into southern Canada. We have 3 different recognized subspecies of purple martins, which I'll just run through quickly here. So the eastern martin occurs throughout eastern North America. It winters in the Amazon. Its status is abundant and declining. I mean, very abundant, like 12 million is one estimate that's been made. And they are entirely dependent on these backyard birdhouses provided by people. There are probably less than 0.0001% of birds nesting in natural cavities in the eastern. So it's made a complete cultural shift in its nesting habits in the eastern population, which started, by the way, back with the Indians who used to hang gourds around their settlements to use the birds as sentries, as warnings. This desert or southwest martin occurs in the Sonoran Desert area, which is characterized by cordon type cactuses. Its winter range is actually unknown, but there are studies advancing now to determine where that subspecies goes. Its status is really not known, but based on my direct experience and what I've read, it seems to be moderately abundant throughout the range of the Sonoran Desert. But of course, that habitat, like all habitats, is declining as development and other conversion eliminates the cactus habitat. It nests entirely in saguaro cactus and in, I always forget the name, Oregon pipe cactus is the other one that it will use. Our western purple martin, it's in the Pacific and montane western regions, the Rockies. It winters separately from the eastern martins in the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil, which of course is a highly endangered ecosystem. Its population is low, which I'll give you numbers on later. And it's either declining, as it is here in California, or more stable in other portions of its range. So this shows you the range of the western purple martin. And as you can see, it basically occupies the Rocky Mountains, particularly in the south, some of the Basin Range mountains, the Uintas in Utah, the higher elevation areas of Arizona and New Mexico, and then from Baja California in the high elevation conifer regions, north through British Columbia. So it's really more a forest bird. And then the southern purple martin is down here in the Sonoran Desert. So what are some of the differences between the western martin and the eastern martin? Well, first of all, they are genetically distinct. They have their populations separated by the glaciers about 200,000 years ago based on genetic analysis. They are much less abundant, as I mentioned. And when I say much, I mean much. The estimate for the western purple martin throughout its range is about 7,000 birds. That might have increased a little bit recently with nest boxes in the north. But that compares to about 12 million birds that was estimated as the population in the east. So the eastern population is declining and people are concerned, but you're still talking about, 3 more zeros than the western population. The plumage in the western bird in the female and in the second year male is lighter than in the, I hope I said lighter in the western bird than in the eastern birds. And sometimes the field guides don't show that well, and you'll see females in the field guides that look very dark. But the most recent field guides, I think National Geo and Sibley, both show the western forms, which are, as I said, quite a bit lighter. They're larger. They're about 4% larger, the western martins than the eastern ones. And the southwestern martin is smaller than the eastern. And they have different nest sites. Our birds do not, with the exception of one guy who's trained them in Oregon, they don't use apartment style nest boxes in the West. So this shows you the types of nest sites that are used by western purple martins. And there's a trend as you go from north to south. In British Columbia, the population was nearly eliminated. It was down to a population in the 20s, probably primarily as a result of starling competition. They began a large nest box program 100% of the birds are in nest boxes, and the population has increased to somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 8,000 birds now. So really a big success story. In Washington, it's about 90% nest boxes, 10% natural snags, 50-50 in Oregon. In California, we have very few birds in nest boxes, only 2 sites that I'm aware of where birds are using nest boxes. And I think I know, I would know where all the sites would be. And about 10% of the population is nesting in bridges, which we'll talk about in more detail. And then other Western states, it's strictly snags, as far as I know, although there's some reports of birds nesting in cliffs near Flagstaff, Arizona. So what's the status in California? Well, formerly purple martins were considered locally common throughout the state, except in the desert and high mountain regions. Its range expanded as it was colonizing buildings in the Central Valley and the foothills. So Grinnell and Miller, the primary source of information about bird status and distribution, referred to it as increasing in the 1940s. Unfortunately, the range and abundance has been greatly reduced since the arrival of the European starling as a breeder in the 1960s and 70s. The starling, of course, is also a cavity nester. You can see with that sharp beak, it's an aggressive competitor and will oust martins from their holes. And of course, the habitat that we've created here, especially in the Central Valley, is ideal for large starling populations. So they've essentially wiped out the species everywhere in the Central Valley, except the population I'm going to talk about later in Sacramento. So now they are highly localized, except in the north coast of California, where they're still relatively abundant. This shows you the eBird distribution. Again, this map sort of, just by the way it's created, suggests greater abundance than are really there. The species is really still localized, and as you see, primarily concentrated along the coast, inland mountains, the Bay Area, the North Bay Area, and a real scattering on the Modoc Plateau and in the Sierra Nevada, and then populations along the coast in Southern California and up in the mountains. So it's mostly been eliminated in the Cascades, the Sierra, Central Valley, and much of Southern California. So what do we know about the population status and trend? Well, there have been no comprehensive population surveys. It's a challenging bird to survey for one reason. The historical records of the birds was summarized by Brian Williams for his master's thesis back in the 1980s. And he accumulated all the records of martins that he could find anywhere during that period. The next, and again, that was published in the 90s when starling populations were still increasing. The bird species of special concern, you may be familiar with that document. Brian Williams and I worked on that, and we kind of updated the status at that point. And we made an estimate of about 1,300 to 1,800 nesting pairs in California at that time. The next status assessment was one that I did in 2009 of the status in Northern California, and I'll talk about more detail on that. And otherwise, there's just sort of localized, a few sites where we have localized long-term or periodic monitoring, which I'll show you in a minute. So I thought I'd present a little bit of the results of this Northern California assessment. I realize it's dated, but it's kind of all we have. And the goals of that study were to evaluate abundance at sites where we had adequate historical information so that we could return to those sites and examine whether the birds were still present there. We also addressed occupancy rates at other previously occupied sites. So if we had abundance estimates, we'd go back and evaluate, has the population gone up or down? In many cases, we didn't have abundance. We just had species was present. And so we just evaluated whether the species was still present at those sites. And as long as we were going there, we determined the numbers so that the next round of surveys will have numbers to compare at the various sites. So these studies areas were various. They included bridges in Sacramento and along the coast, particularly Highway 1, both in, there we go. But we looked at bridge sites in Highway 1, both in the Central Coast and on the North Coast. Overall, we looked at 45 sites in 15 different Northern California counties where birds had been known to occur during the 1990s. 42 of those were actually previously occupied, and we added a few that we found or that had been more recently reported. This is the range of different nest substrates that martins were using in Northern California. 21 sites in bridges, 18 in snags, a few in caves, poles, and 1 in nest boxes, which are nest boxes that we put up in Shelter Cove in Humboldt County. So this does not necessarily reflect the distribution of use by martins as a whole. We tended to go to more bridges because, you know, bridges are fixed. You know where they are and you can find them. But if somebody says, oh, I saw him in a snag, you know, out on such and such road, you don't necessarily know if you're going to refine that place. And so you aren't certain, you know, whether you accurately determined whether they were there or not. So that's why we had so many bridge sites. Here's what the trends look like. You may have to move the, what do you call it, the pictures around a little bit to see here. But essentially, there were only 4 sites in Northern California that had any consistent monitoring that might allow us to assess trends. Shasta Lake had an early survey and then scattered surveys suggested the population there was stable. Those are birds nesting in snags that have been flooded after the creation of the reservoir. Red Hills Road on the west side of Clear Lake, we really only had 3 surveys over just about a 10-year period, but there was no indication of a decline there. The Gualala River, this was actually a breeding bird survey site where one of the stops was at the river, and we just summarized the number of birds by 5-year period to see whether there was any trend, and it was down and then back up. So it seemed variable, but generally stable. And then Sacramento, that you're going to hear about later, suffered a major decline. So most of these areas are in less disturbed sites, low pesticides, low starling populations because they're more wooded and not agricultural. So that's something to keep in mind. So then the second component was to go to those sites where, well, we don't really have good numbers of how many were there in the past, but we at least know they were there, and are they still there? And this is the results of that survey of those sites. We had 31 of them scattered, as you can see, across these 4 regions. And the occupancy of those sites overall was about 58%. The losses, as you might expect, were greater in colonies that were in snags because, you know, snags fall down and the birds may have just moved to a newly created snag. So it's hard to judge exactly what that means, but that's what the data showed. And the permanent sites where we know they were there, the loss was about 44%. Some of that is due to vegetation encroachment on some of these bridge sites, which kind of ironically, they went back in and did a bunch of retrofitting to some of these bridges, which cleared out the vegetation and made them more suitable for martins. So this is something to be aware of, that martins are not a wilderness species. They figure out, they have certain needs and they can be met in a lot of different ways. So The overall loss, however, is about 3% per year, which is concerning, but it's complicated. We can't say exactly that reflects a decline in the population, but it's the best that we can do, and it appears that there is decline for whatever reason. There's sort of some what I would call indications of population status that are kind of fragmentary and incidental, but hey, it's all we have. Some of the positive attributes, things that we've seen, we were able to establish a second nest box colony in Napa. Boxes had been put up and were eventually occupied after 10 years. We added boxes and we're augmenting that population, working with the landowner. So that's positive. I did a partial resurvey of 7 bridge sites in coastal Mendocino County last year. They weren't fully up to the protocol that I generally want to use, which is 3 surveys per year. But nonetheless, those surveys were reassuring. They showed all the sites that had been occupied in 2009 were still occupied. And in fact, one site that had been lost had been reoccupied. And the numbers generally appear similar at those areas. We're also seeing a small increase in numbers in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, although this could be a result of greater birder interest and attention being given to the bird. There are unfortunately some negative indications. The Lava Beds National Monument population, which is really a unique situation where if you've been to lava beds, you have these lava tubes that are created, tunnels where the lava flowed through across the ground, and the birds were actually flying down in below the ground into these big lava chambers and nesting up in the tops here. And after 100 years of occupancy, they've been eliminated. There are none left. Another thing that I was hoping is, as we saw all these burned areas, Martins Lake open areas and snags, we thought we would see a lot of birds occupying some of the burns that have been so prevalent lately. Rodney Siegel from Institute for Bird Populations was doing blackback woodpecker surveys of many of those sites. And unfortunately, only 3 of 133 sites that they surveyed were occupied by martins. So this is not the savior for the species that we kind of hoped. And then continued decline in Sacramento, which I'm going to cover in detail in a moment. So what are the conclusions regarding the statewide status? Central Valley, Sierra Nevada, Bay Area, lowland Southern California, the populations are substantially declined or completely extirpated. The Central Coast, things are a little uncertain. The bird colonies have declined quite a bit, by about 2/3, but that our assessment may be biased because we were looking mostly at bridges, and there are probably some tree populations that might be doing fine. That's the most I can say. And then on the North Coast, all the indications are that the species is really doing pretty well and is abundant and stable from all we can tell. This is based on limited data. And you might ask the question, well, why is the status different in different areas? And I think it really has to do with these potential factors, starling abundance and perhaps use of insecticides, which again, I keep saying, we'll talk about that in more detail later. But, starlings are not common in woody areas. They like open habitats because they forage on the ground. So in the North Coast, you don't have as much open area, and the starling populations are lower. So this raises kind of an interesting issue. What does this mean concerning this Endangered Species Act and how the species should or shouldn't be treated under the act? We have a situation in which most of the population in the state has been substantially reduced or eliminated, and yet we have one stronghold where the species seems to be doing fine. So there are things called distinct population segments that are recognized in the Federal Endangered Species Act, but they're not recognized in the state act. So I have not pushed this issue. We're in a situation where we probably don't have enough data to sustain a listing petition, and we don't have enough data because the species is not listed. And it has, when it gets listed, you get money. So we're in a catch-22 situation. Not enough data to list, can't get money because it's not listed. So I'm going to turn now to where I've spent all this time over these many years in Sacramento and talk to you about this population. We can start at the beginning with Marten history in the Central Valley in Sacramento. This is an early picture of what Sacramento looked like, downtown Sacramento, soon after or right around 1849. Before 1849 or 59, presumably martens nested in snags throughout the valley, but we really don't know how abundantly, how widely distributed they were. But interestingly, as early as 1876, when Robert Ridgway, a famous, one of the preeminent ornithologists, came to Sacramento to conduct surveys for the railroad, as John Harris has summarized in one of his articles in that great journal, Central Valley Birds, that they had martens nesting in buildings as early as 1876, which is just amazing to me. And what they were using up until the 1960s were these tile roof buildings that had little recesses underneath them. And the birds were common in most Central Valley towns, Colusa, Chico, Oroville, Auburn, Sacramento. They didn't get down too much into the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, apparently. But they were very common right up until the 60s. And as I mentioned before, Grinnell and Miller said that the population was increasing due to the use of buildings. Well, the next phase in marten history in Sacramento and the Central Valley was the 1970s to the 2000s. And this is the period when the starling arrived and began building up populations. Only in Sacramento did the martens learn to adopt the undersides of these elevated freeways and overpasses. And they go inside these holes. We call them weep holes, but they're really just air pressure regulators. They let the air in and out. And the birds go up inside these holes and nest in these structures in the highly urbanized area. This is a light rail station on 29th and R Street, in the middle of Midtown Sacramento. So starlings arrived and completely outcompeted martens from buildings between 1965 and 1975. And the only place that they, and did so from all of the Central Valley, except in Sacramento, where the population persisted in these bridges. Well, that population was quite healthy and was increasing, and I was documenting that increase up until 2004. And this shows you what the population trend is since 2003. And what you can see, obviously, is we reached our high in 2004 of 172 pairs of martens nesting at 12 different colony sites. And over the next 4 years, we lost half of the birds. And then we continued to lose birds at a slower rate. And now we seem to be kind of bouncing around at about 20 to 25 pairs. So, the number of colonies has declined from 12 to 5. Overall, it's an 88% decline in this population. And one important thing to note is that this decline occurred across all colony sites. It wasn't localized to one or a few particular sites. Well, in doing our studies, one of the things that we did was really try to identify what are the key habitat components for martens so that we could protect that. Insect food supply is critical. Again, they're aerial insectivores. They're also feeding high on the food chain, feeding on predatory insects, not phytophagous or plant feeding insects. So they're one step up the food chain, which means they're more sensitive to changes in populations than other swallows that feed on Phytophagous insects. We also have described the bridge nesting sites. They need to be long because this is a big bird that circles around and to protect its territory. And so they need to be 85 meters or about 250 feet long. They need to have adequate flight access. So they need to be able to get in and out. You can't have buildings or trees blocking the access. And they have to have enough airspace below. If you have, sometimes they build mini storage buildings or put other buildings that wrap around these freeways, and that eliminates the potential for use. The other two things that we've focused on, they require a source of nesting material, which you would think would be easy, but because they're nesting in such highly urbanized areas, it's not always readily available. And as a result, we put out nesting material for these birds each year, and they readily take it at certain colonies where we don't have very much. And then they use perch sites as a way to guard the female, to guard the nest hole, to interact. So all of those factors need to be present in combination to have purple martins. Sal, I see a bunch of questions in the chat. Do you want to pose any of those, or do you want to just?
I think let's go ahead and wait till the end, and then we'll because there's not a lot of people, and they can ask these questions, or I can go through the whole thing.
Okay, management actions. You know, we haven't just been sitting here studying them. We've been trying to do things to conserve this population. So one is installing these things that we call nest guards, which is a not hog wire. What do you call it? I forgot the name of it right now. But anyway, 1/2 inch mesh wire that we cut and wrap and stick up into these holes. And it forms a little barrier, a little railing, if you will, because we were having problems with the birds coming to the entrance hole like this and then tumbling out of the nest. And this has reduced that. We've rehabilitated the fallouts that occur, but to tell you the truth, they never come back. So it's not really effective. It's a feel-good measure. We've installed perch wires, which has been effective in some cases in reducing collisions with light rail and trains because by moving them up out of the way. We've installed nest boxes like here, which have not been adopted in either within Sacramento. So we went to where the birds were and installed them. And then we went to the Yolo bypass and said, well, if I was a martin, this is where I would want to be, where all the insects are. And we couldn't get them to use boxes at either site. We've managed vegetation for access. So when the trees start to grow up, we work with landowners to get them to remove the impediment to access. And we try to protect that when there are projects that are leading to, planting vegetation. I mentioned we provide nesting material and also calcium. We throw out chicken or oyster shells that the poultry people use, and they readily pick those up and use them as grit. We are contemplating and trying to manage predator nesting habitat, particularly for American kestrels, which sometimes nest in the buildings near these colonies and can create havoc in certain years. But we've not been successful at finding the nest sites and blocking them to eliminate the kestrels from the area. So I'm going to come back to the population question, which is why are these birds declining? Why have they declined so much? And we're going to have a little academic lecture here for just a very short period of time. Declines occur when reproduction or recruitment of young to the population occurs at a rate less than the mortality of the adult population. So, if more adults die than young come into the population declines. Simple math. So declines occur when reproduction is low, when adult or juvenile survival is low, or when both are occurring, okay? So we can put those factors into a population equation, which I'm going to translate to English for you in a moment. But essentially, this equation says the population in the next year equals the population the previous year times the rate of survival of adults, plus the number of adults, the reproductive rate of those adults, and then the survival of those birds that were reproduced so that they're recruited to the population. So the population equals the number of adults present last year that survived to this year, plus the number of young produced last year that survived to this year. And we can do some population modeling using this equation to try to understand where are we missing, what's causing the decline, because we have certain of these factors known from our studies. So we know the population size, and we know the adult survival rate from color banding studies that we did back in the 2000s when the population was declining. So we can use the model equation to calculate what reproductive rate or juvenile survival would have to have occurred in order to produce the next year's population. And I know that sounds complicated, but I'm just going to show it to you here, and I think you guys will get it. So here's the 4-year period when we had this drastic decline from 141 pairs to 70. The adult survival rate during that period, again from intensive monitoring of color banded birds, was about 58%. For this modeling exercise, we assume normal juvenile survival based on other studies because we can't get up into these holes and color band our birds. So if you assume that normal survival rate, then you solve the equation for the reproductive rate that would result in the population in the subsequent year. And what you see here are reproductive rates that average about 1.6 young per nest. That's about half of what an average healthy population produces. So this suggests very strongly that the cause of this decline, the immediate cause, not the ultimate, but the immediate cause is lack of reproduction. The adult survival is a little bit low, but the reproductive survival or the juvenile survival, because probably what's happening is this is low for the same reason that this is low. So maybe the real value of the reproduction is a little bit higher and the juvenile survival is a little bit lower, and that leads to the same effect of this kind of decline. Provides strong evidence that low reproductive recruitment is the cause. Another thing that we can do looking at these populations over time is evaluate the rates of decline and then project forward to say, well, under that rate of decline, how long is it going to be before this population is eliminated? And of course, if you remember looking at that graph, there are sort of different rates of decline. The initial one was very steep, then it kind of leveled off, then it dropped steeply again, then it leveled off again. So if you take different periods of time, you have different average annual rates of decline that you could consider in trying to project forward. So if you take for example, the average rate over the last 16 years, this population would be eliminated in 11 years. Now I use the figure decline to 3 pairs as elimination because what we see at these colonies is it's a colonial bird. They want to be together. They need each other for protection, for mating, whatever. And when a colony declines to 3 pairs, it's very likely to disappear in the next year or two. So in 11 years, we'll decline to 3 pairs at this rate of decline, and they'll be gone. If you look at the last 5 years, the rate of decline is only 6%. And that would allow us to be the population to persist as much as 31 years. So the population is predicted to disappear under these rates if something different doesn't happen in the next 5 to 30 years. Now, I will note that, as you can see, this slide's a little old. We did this analysis 2019. In 2020, for the only time since 2004, we had a population increase, and it increased by 25%, which sounds like a lot, but basically it went from 20 to 25 pairs. But then it dropped again the subsequent year. So, you know, these things will fluctuate around depending on what years you select. But if it's declining, it's inevitably going to disappear at some point. So why is it declining? Well, this was a huge mystery to us for a decade or more. We just did not know what could be happening. We thought it was vehicle collisions, but you know, it just didn't fit because some sites had a lot of traffic and others didn't, and they all declined. So we started looking at different factors and thinking what's consistent with the pattern that we're seeing. So some potential causes almost seem to have no effect. Competition with starlings, swifts, and other species, you know, the starlings eliminated them from most areas in the Central Valley, but we don't see a lot of starling competition in our bridges because starlings start nesting earlier. They have very little foraging habitat in these highly urbanized, you know, concrete jungle areas. And because they start early, and there's so many holes in these bridges, we're talking at each of these sites, you have, you know, 30 to, you know, 200 holes available. So the starlings choose theirs, then the martins come and they pick theirs, and everybody's happy. We looked at general human disturbance, but we have plenty of examples of birds tolerating human disturbance, and in fact, moving from less disturbed areas into more disturbed areas because other conditions like perch sites were created to be better. We looked at climate change. You know, that seems like an obvious thing, but look at what's happened to the climate, or what hasn't happened to the climate during the martins breeding season here. The green line is 2003 to 2006. The red 2015 to 2018. There's really no change except a slight increase in temperature during April. And that would be beneficial to the birds because that's a period of stress when they may not be getting enough insects when you're down at average 60 degrees temperature. Now, we know the temperature has increased in August, September, October, November, but the birds are gone in early August. So this just does not, even though it could be considered a widespread effect, it just doesn't really exist. I should also note that we also have seen no change in timing of martins. So they aren't adapting to climate because there isn't much change that they have experienced. I'd also note those big, bulky cement structures are kind of resistant to heating and cooling. So that's probably also reducing any effects of climate should they occur. Another set of potential factors that could be causing the decline, we determined they're localized, or they only occur at a few colonies. So they can't be causing, the cause for widespread decline at all the colonies. These factors include vehicle collisions, as I mentioned before. We had a problem with feral cat predation at one site, but it only was for a year or so, and we got rid of that cat feeding station and took care of the problem. Kestrel predation, I mentioned. Here's a kestrel with a young martin that they took out of a hole at one of our sites, but it's only been at 2 sites. And again, sort of ironically, increase in the amount of development at some of these sites has reduced the quality of the habitat for starlings, and they're becoming less of a problem. So these factors may be contributing to the decline, periodically and locally, but they aren't the cause of widespread decline. So then we have factors that are widespread, consistent with the decline, but the effects are limited. I mentioned nestling fallout. Well, the numbers of we looked at the numbers of nestlings that are lost from these holes. And when you don't have the nest guards in there, you lose about 1 young per 3 nests, 0.37. When you have the guards in, it reduces it to 1 young per 10 nests. But that's still not a huge number that would drive the population to the kind of decline that we've seen. And I should also note that we've put these things in at 2 out of the 5 colonies. So the effect has been ameliorated. The others are challenging to get to. So now we get to, well, what's the only thing that is both widespread and would appear to be substantial? And that is the potential effects of neonicotinoid pesticides. And that takes its effect by reducing insect prey, which results in lower survival and reproduction, particularly of young. It's somewhat of a hypothesis, but I'm going to bring you the circumstantial data that I think demonstrates this pretty clearly. This shows you the pattern of increase in neonicotinoid use. These are the insecticides that are, attributed to causing the honeybee collapse or contributing to it. Yeah. And you see the rapid increase in the use of neonics in the Central Valley, which corresponds with the timing of when we had suffered that loss. I'll zoom in a little further and show you what the use pattern looks like in Sacramento and Yolo counties. So these would be the local areas that these birds would be associated with. And what you see here is a dramatic increase in use exactly when the dramatic decline occurred. It's somewhat stabilized and then unfortunately has shot up again. I only have data through 2017. We need to get that updated, but it's not good. So what is the evidence that this may have caused effects on insect populations? Well, I mean, obviously that's their whole point, right? Is to kill insects. We know that neonics are widespread in the environment. Sampling that's been done has shown that over 1/3 of samples taken in both urban and agricultural waterways are above EPA standards for toxicity. So it's widespread and it's abundant. This is the only data set that we have that is long-term on insect abundance. This is Art Shapiro's surveys of butterfly populations in different areas in the Central Valley and on up into the Sierra. And what you see here is that this is the number of species that he recorded on his transects over time. He did these surveys for 30 years. As far as I know, he may still be doing them. And you see a slight decline right up until about 2000, and then a rapid decline thereafter. Again, consistent with the timing of neonics. This other graph shows you the number of species in relationship to the amount of neonicotinoids that were used at these various sites, because we have very good records of where use occurs and how much. And what you can see there is clearly as neonics increase, the diversity of butterfly species decreases. So that's the best evidence we have for effects on prey. This just shows you the pattern of decline in the martin population along this vertical axis versus the amount of neonicotinoids. And I'm just tracking this. Each of these dots is a consecutive year, and you can see big declines at relatively low neonic use, but then continued declines. And at this point, things seem to be a little bit stabilized, notwithstanding the large decline. What that could mean is that you've eliminated all the insects from the places where neonics are going to. And the birds are now dependent on insects that are hatched from areas like vernal pools, very small streams, places that are not getting an insecticide dose. And that suggests the possibility that we may just have a very low, but perhaps hopefully stable population. Well, it isn't just neonics that are a problem. We also have lots of problems because of the fact that these birds choose to be in urban areas. I'm going to move a little quickly because I realize I'm getting late here, Sal. So we have a lot of challenges here, and those challenges for martins relate to inadequate planning, environmental analysis, design, and construction. And we just have project after project that have not properly considered the needs of purple martins in their planning, design, construction. So examples, this is the I Street Bridge. This area here behind the Railroad Museum, this is looking south on the Sacramento River. This area behind the Railroad Museum, it's the best place for birders to go because there are no homeless people there. It's been occupied for 30 years and it's going to be torn down to build a new bridge. And that bridge is not going to be suitable. We've had active nest disturbance where construction occurred exactly during the period when young were at the nests, and that kept the adults away, and it also attracted kestrels that came in and caused the loss of all four of the nests at that construction site. And we currently have an active threat, which is the Caltrans lane addition. They're building a new freeway lane in between the westbound and eastbound sections of Highway 50. They went in and blocked off all the holes under this 5-mile section, including at 2 colony sites. But I raised a stink, and we finally got, after 30 years, got Caltrans to pay attention, and they're working with us actually pretty diligently to try to protect the birds during this project. But the major problem with all of this urban stuff is I always have to be the one to identify the problem and to tell them what to do. The environmental consultants, the biologists, they come out and they just say, oh, it's an urban area. There's nothing here, and they don't check, they don't know. And so constantly, I'm this guy who has to pop up and say, excuse me, you got a problem here. And that's just not sustainable because I'm not going to do that for the rest of my life. And my life isn't going to last that much longer, right? So what do? Well, we have to protect Sacramento purple martins from impacts of land uses until the pesticide issue can be resolved. That's what we're all about. The conservation actions, we need to address long-term issues, ban or greatly reduce the use of neonicotinoids. And I have some ideas about how that could be done, I believe, somewhat painlessly. We need to conduct a statewide status reassessment to really figure out what's going on. We need to conduct proper land use planning and project implementation. And that includes a set of mitigation measures that I identified that the city adopted for the I Street Bridge, but they're not implementing them because the project's on hold. Those include awareness training, biologist certification, so people know what the hell they're doing when they're out there, installing nest guards at more colonies, trying these experimental nest boxes where now we're putting the holes in the bottom, but they don't really seem to be working either, and continuing the population monitoring. And most importantly, my recommendation for this I Street Bridge was to prepare a comprehensive conservation plan that would lay out all the details of the biology and how birds should be dealt with in planning, design, construction, and environmental analysis. And the city said, no, we won't do it. So I said, all right, well, bleep you, I'll do it. And so I wrote this book, which is all this information on the biology and the management of purple martins in Sacramento. It's very specific, very focused. So it's a comprehensive document summarizing history, ecology, population status, habitat needs, available management actions that can be taken, and an evaluation of those actions, conservation priorities, land use planning guidelines, and very site-specific information on each colony site. So for each colony, we provide, here's where they nest, here's where they perch, here's where they get their nesting material, here's how they access. So the site. So essentially, there's no excuse anymore for doing improper analysis and planning for purple martins. It also includes, monitoring protocols. So if you are interested in this, like on CNN, they always put the book behind the author. If you're interested in seeing this book, it's available from the Central Valley Bird Club on their website, our website. And the money from it goes to support student research scholarships. So if you're interested, go get it. I think it's $30, $25 for members. Okay, the future. The population is going to continue to decline, but the decline is slowing. And maybe, as I said before, maybe we'll have just a low population that'll hang on. The presumed cause is insecticide effects on food supply. New threats are constantly emerging, and sometimes they're unexpected. For example, last year we had a huge fire at a homeless camp underneath one of our colonies. I forgot to mention that a lot of these sites have homeless camps now underneath them. Well, that happened, fortunately. I shouldn't say any fire in a homeless camp is not fortunate, but it happened in September instead of, June. And so it really didn't affect the birds, but it could have. We've tried all the conservation measures we can think of: nest boxes, habitat protection, perch sites. But again, extirpation could occur within 10 to 30 years. We're going to continue to monitor and protect habitat in land use projects. But at this point, we don't really have any other active management contemplated. And as I've said, we need a broader campaign to address insecticides as the ultimate. So martins are not, I want to emphasize, are not likely the only species being affected by neonicotinoids. We just detected it because we spent so much time monitoring. Many insectivorous birds are affected in agriculture, wetland, and urban areas, and nobody's really looked very closely at that. We may not be able to save the Sacramento purple martin population, but we're going to try. And if we do lose the population, it shouldn't be in vain, but at least it should compel conservation action to save other birds in the Central Valley. And I think that does it. And again, I'm sorry if I ran over a bit, but happy to take any questions if you have them.